Alrighty, I've got a big one here for you. Today it's going to be all about suspensions. I will, of course, cover what suspensions might look like in this particular metagame, but I'm also going to be doing a pretty big deep dive on the topic of suspensions as a whole, when I think it's appropriate to use that tool, what kind of things to look for in metagames that might indicate that suspensions might be necessary, and just kind of do a pretty big deep dive into this topic. I will, of course, also talk about the history of suspensions in this game and the cards that have hit that list in the past. Before we get going, please hit that subscribe button, and if you're interested in some more content from me, do check out my Patreon as well. All right, so I'm going to have a pretty detailed table of contents here, and the beginning, it's going to be an overview of suspension. So this isn't going to be really metagame specific. I'm going to be talking about, the topic as a whole, and when I like the kinds of things that we look for in suspensions, and also the kind of discourse that surrounds this topic in general. I'll then be breaking up the main reasons that suspensions happen, at least in my mind. And it's three main pillars for me. The first being competitive balance, the second being poor gameplay, which can include things like randomness, decreased player agency, things like that. And the third being meta diversity, whether it's between leaders or aspects, that sort of thing. And in this section, I will also talk about the cards in the past that have been suspended and where they might fall into these different groupings. Finally, we'll get into the current format. So there will be a bit of an overview of the top stuff in the format, and I'll talk a little bit about what cards have been tossed out there to maybe hit a suspension list, what I think it might do to the format, and of course, whether or not I actually think it's necessary to do anything right now. But yeah, let's get right into it. So, the overview. So, first up, I want to really stress this. There will always be the best deck or best decks. That is never going to go away no matter how many cards you suspend. So, the idea that things need to happen because certain decks are winning a lot, in my mind, is not appropriate. That is not a good reason to suspend something just because things are good. And sometimes things become too good, and that is certainly a reason. But try to get it out of your head that if suspensions happen, all of a sudden the meta becomes wide open and every deck has a perfectly even win rate against every other deck, and all these underplayed leaders all of a sudden become good. That's just not going to happen. Simply, the goalposts shift a little bit when suspensions happened. Other things that were already good usually end up just filling the void and become better. Very rarely do brand new strategies show up. It's just not really the nature of TCGs in general. So I want to just stress that. The goal of the suspension, when it happens, is to improve the game, specifically the gameplay, right? It's to make the game more fun. Otherwise, there would be no point in doing it. So there's various things that can make the game unfun in a particular meta, right? Where it's there's only one deck that's even remotely good enough to play, so either you play it and play a bunch of mirrors, or you're just always at a disadvantage. That's not particularly fun. Then there's things that aren't really about balance, poor gameplay loops, and we'll get a little more in detail in a moment on that. But yes, the goal is to make the game better. And every meta does have its own problems. That's just natural. You'll see complaints about the meta no matter what it is all the time. Always. That is never going to stop, I promise you. So we have to try to filter out when there's actually a problem and when it's just us complaining, right? Because, I do it too sometimes. I don't enjoy every meta game, and there's times where I've thought suspensions need to happen, and sometimes they have, and sometimes they haven't. But there's not going to be a utopia meta where 100 leaders are playable, they all have 50-50 win rates against each other, and it's just the paradise. Yeah, not really possible. And so piggyback on that, there's just never going to be a meta that everyone enjoys, right? The complaints will always be there. The source of the complaints will shift around, right? Some people might enjoy a particular meta, but then a new one comes, they don't like that, and then vice versa. there will always be someone somewhere who doesn't particularly enjoy a certain meta, and we have to try to like figure out when that becomes a majority. Well, I don't have to figure it out. Usually the developers and the designers have to figure it out to see if changes need to be made to improve everyone's enjoyment. Another thing, and very important, good cards will always prevent diversity. So that is just like the truth about card games in general, right? You don't hear a lot about the card Battlefield Marine, right? But this card is a major diversity crusher. In set 1, for instance, very few 2-drops in the game were playable because of this card, and to some extent, Sabine unit, right? There was a very good deck, the Sabine aggro deck, that played Battlefield Marine and Sabine. You basically just couldn't play 2/3s in that format because they would just die to this, right? We weren't really complaining about Battlefield Marine very much, though, and we still don't. And now the format has shifted a little bit where there's 2/4s as a different baseline stat. So there's that like turn 1 dynamic of like your opponent starts a 3/3 and now you just can't play a unit has decreased. Like that, the amount of times that happened has decreased. But there's no question Battlefield Marine was a major diversity crusher in this game for a very long time and didn't get a lot of hate towards it, right? So this is more just to like kind of show you good cards are always going to kind of prevent lesser cards from entering the meta. So you start banning cards or suspending cards because they're good, you're not going to create meta diversity. You're just going to create a new level where the new good cards will just be a different like level of cards, and they will still prevent all those below them from seeing a lot of play. So you see more complaints about like big robust effects like super laser blast. This is annoying. This is keeping me from playing swarm mid-range aggro or like whatever. Swarm mid-range aggro doesn't make much sense. But anyway, yes, in some way super laser blast does prevent a certain amount of cards or strategies from existing in a way. Is it any more than Battlefield Marine does? Maybe even less, actually. Like, Battlefield Marine might actually have kept more cards out of the game than Super Laser Blast ever did. But it's not as in your face. So, this whole tangent is just to kind of explain that just because something's good does not mean it needs to go away. We will always find something to complain about. I've kind of said this a few times. And I say it as like in jest. It's like the collective us. The us in that statement shifts around always, but there, from the start, from set 1, I've never seen a period of time in this game where there weren't complaints about the meta, right? So I don't expect that to change. It's not always better afterwards, though, right? Keep that in mind. And sometimes we don't know, right? When a suspension doesn't happen, we don't actually know if it would have been better for the game if it did happen, and vice versa. When a suspension does happen, it's a little easier to tell if it was better or worse before and after in that sense, but not always entirely clear, especially when it happens before something has had a large chance to develop, right? A good example of that was Boba, who was suspended before set 3 events even started. So, like, do we know for certain that the meta was better with him gone or not? You have to use an educated guess there. One thing about suspensions, and I enjoy this element, is it adds a little bit of freshness to the game. So you're going to hear some points throughout this video where I maybe push back on the idea of suspensions currently, but it's not so much like from my own, I should say I would actually enjoy suspensions. I kind of would always enjoy them because I think it adds like a new meta. There's like a new honeymoon period of deck brewing. There's this unknown sort of element going into events where like, oh, maybe we found something cool. I get to do like videos about suspensions. I get to like make new decks on Patreon and all this kind of stuff. So don't take my pushback against suspensions when I do get to that as some indication that I just want the meta to stay as is. I would very much always kind of like when it happens, but I understand that that's not really the norm, and also not really the way balance should be done. There shouldn't be suspensions just because some people like the meta shifting more often than every 4 months, which is every time a new set comes out. Like for the last few sets, we have had mid-set suspensions, which has kind of given us an extra rotation or an extra new meta in between every set release, but I don't know if that's necessary every time. All right, so let's get into like the details of the 3 main pillars of suspensions, and this is just putting this up on the screen. These are the 5 cards that have been suspended in the past, right? Boba Fett, Jango Fett, Force Throw, Triple Dark Raid, and DJ. These are what have hit the list in the past, and they'll come up throughout this next topic. But first up, reason for suspension number 1, competitive balance. So this sort of suspension pillar entirely depends on competitive metagames and competitive results. This is not going to look at locals or showdowns. This is going to look at PQs and higher, and of course weighting things like sectors and regionals much higher than PQs as well, to see if there's a big major issue in deck balance. And this is deck balance specifically. This isn't like colors being out of whack or certain strategies being out of whack. This is, oh, this deck is too good, it is winning too much, and it's making it unfun because like it's pushing towards you have to play this leader and archetype or you can't compete at the same level. So I would argue these are the only 2 suspensions that have happened so far that have been that have hit this pillar, right? And I'm not saying this pillar is more important than the other 2 we're going to talk about, but the other cards that have been suspended, Force Throw, DJ, and Triple Dark Raid, I do not believe were suspended for competitive balance. They fit in some of these other pillars. But Boba Fett, he was very dominant, right? This leader was hitting extreme rates of top 8 conversions, was the most winning leader in the set 2 PQs, which, you know, were minimal, but it also like piggybacks on set 1 where he was also very dominant. Set 2, it was even worse just because of some new toys that he got. He was just bigger and badder than basically any leader in the game, and the whole game revolved around him. He was out of whack. He was designed. He was a balance mistake from the start because of the numbers that were placed on him. The 4/7 stat line, which has basically been reserved to 6-cost leaders, was on a 5-cost leader. So a pure balance ban in my mind. Jango Fett, very similar, right? Once Jump to Lightspeed came out, this deck got the toys that could exhaust full boards with 1 action, like War Juggernaut, Devastator, IG-2000, and this became format suffocating, right? It was winning the sectors over and over again. It was topping. It was huge percentages of the top meta games in PQs and in those bigger events, and it was just out of whack, right? There was kind of no justification to ever play anything except Jango. Now, of course, a lot of us didn't play Jango. I didn't play Jango. But it was probably objectively incorrect. And that deck, the Jump to Lightspeed Jango deck, is probably the most powerful deck that we have seen to date, and the most unbalanced deck so far, even more so than Boba in his heyday. Now, they never had a chance to share a meta together, so what would have happened if Boba was legal at the time, I cannot tell you. But that Jango deck was broken, and he went away for it. And competitive balance is very important. This is one of the 2 more important pillars in my mind, right? It's 1A or 1B. It depends on like what angle you're coming from, but you're talking about competitive events, there should be competitive balance. When something is so out of whack that it's kind of objectively correct to be playing it, then that is probably a good time to start hitting some cards and making some suspensions. All right, pillar number 2, one that I think might be more important than competitive balance, but it's certainly, if not, the second most important for me, is poor gameplay. Now, this is important because this is a game, and the purpose of this is to have fun. So when certain things remove fun from the individual games that people are having, that's a problem. Now, this can come in many forms, right? If there was a card that said, flip a coin, heads you win, tails you lose, that would be a perfectly balanced card that would make horrific gameplay, right? That's like the most extreme example of this. So randomness is something that we don't love, especially when there's already a lot of randomness built into card games, right? You're drawing cards from the top of a deck. That's random from the start, right? Initiative is decided randomly from the start of the game. Your matchup is going to be random. So we don't love cards usually that add even more randomness. And we don't love cards that reduce player agency or make you have to play suboptimally just because you could get blown out by something. These are kind of two very in-your-face kind of ways to create poor gameplay. So let's look at some examples of where this might have happened. And I'd argue 4 of the 5 suspensions have all fit into this. And I've excluded Boba Fett because honestly, he was very good, but there was nothing like the gameplay itself wasn't like horrific. He was just too strong. There wasn't like a lot of randomness. He wasn't like suffocating other deck choices and like inherently. It was just like a mid-range deck. You could still play other things. He was just better than them. But all these other ones, and we'll start with Force Throw because I think this might have been the most egregious one, at least for me. And I still see people suggest that this card shouldn't have been suspended, which is wild to me. This might be, like, in my opinion, the Force Throw meta after Legends of the Force was the worst meta we've had to date. And it's my opinion, right? Everyone is welcome to their own. That was the least fun I've had since the game came out, was Force Throw meta. I thought this card was just poor gameplay personified. This took so much player agency out of games. The amount of times I had people tell me that Force Throw was easy to play around because you can hold cheap cards was a lot, but I promise you, Force Throw was not easy to play around, and most games in Force Throw mirror sort of situations, or even non-Force Throw mirrors, revolved around who drew more of this card or when someone drew this card. This card was busted, and it added so much variance into the game, like crazy amounts. Games being decided on turn 2 on the spot sometimes. People not being able to play leaders because certain leaders because this was throwing Krayt Dragons at them on turn 4 every game, and you just would never be able to flip a leader, and the card costs 1, so it's impossible to like really play around. Yeah, you could hold all your bad cards in your hand all game in case they had Force Throw. And then sometimes it wouldn't matter because even them discarding like a 2-drop from your hand was relevant. And then sometimes they don't have Force Throw, and now you just nuke your whole hand, right? You kept a bunch of bad cards in your hand to play around a card they didn't have. And then, all the cases where they drew like 2 of these and just like did it twice in one turn, you just instantly lose. This was wildly poor gameplay in my mind. I thought this card needed to be suspended a lot earlier than it ended up being suspended. The meta did become better when it was gone. And, it didn't even kill off all the decks it was in completely. In fact, one of the best decks was still like Hantu Blue at the time, even after Force Throw was suspended. What it did do was kill a lot of Legends of the Force decks, which is unfortunate, but I think more of an indictment on the Legends of the Force set than it is on the need for Force Throw in the game. If this card was the only reason those decks were playable, then that's probably a bigger issue in the set. Another one, Triple Dark Raid, right? We talked about randomness. Well, there you go. This is RNG. This is, you could find a 2-drop or you can find Devastator and hit your opponent for 13. And no one really loves losing to that sort of RNG. And this was suspended with Django. And there was talk about like, well, why hit this if Django is gone? Well, the reason you hit this card is because there is nothing particularly engaging about a card that has such a wide power spike in it, especially when it's random based. It doesn't create good gameplay. I do not think it's a particularly enjoyable card to lose to. And although losing is never really enjoyable, there are degrees of enjoyment in losing. And feeling like you have your opponent under control completely and you're at 17 and having your opponent play a 6 resource play that hits you for 13 because they randomly found a Devastator on the top of their deck it's not great, right? We don't want a galactic championship or a sector qualifier to be decided by that kind of high variance dice roll. So that is another one that I think added poor gameplay. DJ, pretty self-explanatory. This got hit with Django, and a sort of a preemptive suspension, I should say, because at the time, Han, especially Han Yellow, was not a very popular deck. And it was kind of under the radar because of Django's dominance. And I thought it was very appropriate that this was hit preemptively to not give it another chance to kind of like mess up a format. And DJ is another card that I thought needed to get suspended way earlier than it did. I thought it needed to get suspended when Bobo was suspended. I just didn't think there was any reason to let this kind of effect stay in a game, especially when so many other like effects like this just don't exist and are kind of preemptively blocked off from existing. Somehow one of the best leaders in the game, which was Han 1, was given a tool that could blow up people's resources and ramp himself on curve on his flip turn. It just wasn't good. This was all suffocating a lot of the game. We'll get to DJ in a moment because it's going to show up in another pillar. But there is nothing fun about DJ blowing up a resource. It was not easy to play around. No matter how many people told me you could hold takedown in your hand to play around this, it wasn't easy because, you know, you sit there and pass, right? And then your opponent just plays a different 7-drop and like you just wasted your whole turn trying to play around this. And then, of course, it was also just a very well statted 3-drop, so it wasn't even using much like deck cost to include it. But yeah, like if you're gonna include effects like this in a game, they need to be in more places. Like, I don't mean just like resource stealing specifically. I mean like really, really powerful build around effects like this that are not nerfed in any way, right? Think something like Miggs Mayfield, but there's no limit to how many times his effect can trigger in a turn, right? Like those kinds of things. A lot of units and cards have safety valves built into them, and DJ was simply one that didn't. And Django is another one. So he's the last one that I think added poor gameplay, primarily because this game is mostly about unit combat. Hard control has existed. There is like one archetype that is not really fighting on the unit versus unit combat axis. But basically every other deck does. And it was a stated goal of the devs that unit combat be a very important part of the game. And Django was like, nah, we're good here. Your units don't get to do that in these parts. And, you know, no safety valve on this. And I think that's the main issue with this leader is that they just didn't put a safety valve on it. There's no reason he should have allowed limited exhausts on his unit side, right? That would have immediately prevented the complete bustedness of like things like War Juggernaut from really breaking the game. Once a turn, there's no reason it needed more than that. I also don't think it should have hit leaders. Like so many other effects say non-leader, but for some reason this guy says your ISB agent, which costs 1, can exhaust the leader. There were other ways they could have maybe added another safety valve, like cost. Like if the unit it can only exhaust units of like the same or less cost, right? So ISB agent all of a sudden can't be exhausting Avengers and stuff like that. So there's a lot of ways that this could have led to better gameplay, but unfortunately it just didn't. And it was a pretty balanced archetype until they decided to print a bunch of cards that do mass exhaust with his ability, but there's no going back from that without an errata. So he had to go. All right, and the last reason for suspension, and one that I think currently is very much in like the forefront of people's minds, is meta diversity. This is probably the one that I think is least important of the 3 pillars. And also I think gets vastly overstated what it means for a meta to be diverse or not. But there's multiple ways you can look at this, right? There's leader diversity. How many leaders would you consider like PQ tier or sector tier, right? Tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, whatever bucket they fit in. Right now, we have a decent amount of leaders that have won PQs. Now, I wouldn't call like the one-off wins as like an indication that those leaders are good enough. They largely aren't, but there's a lot that have made multiple top 8 conversions, and that's when you start to be like, okay, this is at least in the range. The other is color or aspect diversity, another one that's going to come up a bit when we talk about the current format because of the green thing. Green is kind of everywhere, but that's another one. Leader diversity, color diversity, strategy diversity. So the main 3 archetypes of the game are aggro, mid-range, control. Those are usually split up a little bit, right? Control has often been 2 different camps. One is like event hard control, where it's like very few units, and one would be like more unit-based soft control. Aggro can also be fit into a few different categories. Some are just like pure turbo face decks. Think like Sabine, or even like some of the pilot aggro, and those two aren't very similar, right? There's space aggro, ground aggro, but then there's also like tempo aggro, a deck like Quinlan, for instance, very much an aggro deck, just it feels different than like a Sabine deck. And then mid-range, right? Mid-range can have a lot of different main focuses as well. And we have a lot of mid-range decks right now, and a lot of them don't play similarly. Some are more aggressive, something like an Anakin mid-range deck, and some are more controlling, like a Yoda mid-range deck. But they still mostly fit that role of like units on curve, impactful leader, closeout game with like 7-8 drops. We're not playing like infinite removal. We're just kind of trying to like play value. So those are like the 3 things that I think are the main topics of meta diversity, right? Leaders, aspects, strategies. So let's see what may have been an issue in the past, right? So, of course, when you have a leader that is like objectively better than every other leader, that affects meta diversity, right? Boba Fett, like why even play another villain yellow deck when Boba Fett exists? He's just the better version. And then he was so good that it's like, well, if we play our villain hard control deck, we might as well just have Boba be our leader and play yellow blue. And if we want to play our aggro villain deck, well, Boba's so good, why don't we just play mono yellow Boba? If we want to play our Boba mid-range deck, our villain mid-range deck, why don't we just play it with Boba and do Boba green? And then even red got thrown in there too. So Boba was definitely affecting meta diversity, and Jango as well, because Jango was so good, and he also eliminated so many unit-based strategies from the game simply because he said none of your opponent's units could attack, that he affected the diversity in the game. The last one I would say that include here is DJ, because what DJ did was say your leaders that cost 6 or more are mostly unplayable. There were some that hung around. I think like Ray at the time, Ray Red, was like a deck that kind of was able to like sneak in there. Maybe even Cad Bane a little bit, but largely neither of those decks were very good. At least not in comparison to something like Mono Yellow Han or Jango at the time in set 3. DJ was around for 2 sets. He was a little under the radar for set 2 because Boba had Mono Yellow Han's number, but DJ was very much affecting meta diversity in the leader department, not so much in the strategy department or the aspect diversity, but mostly in like what leaders were playable. Force Throw and Triple Dark Raid, not really. In fact, Force Throw enabled a lot of decks and a lot of strategies. You could say that it made red more popular. Aspect diversity, I think, is like largely overblown in its importance. First of all decks basically play 2 colors, so even if one of the colors is red, doesn't mean the other colors aren't getting played. But yeah, like I think that of the 3 is probably a little overblown. But Force Throw I don't think was like really affecting meta diversity. The format in Force Throw was quite diverse. It was the gameplay that was the problem. And Triple Dark Raid as well. That's not a meta diversity issue. It was just a gameplay issue. But we will talk about this again going into our next topics. So this is the current format. So let's do a little recap on what the current format looks like. First of all, green is everywhere. No doubt. Green is in almost every top deck in the game right now. It's the most common color in both villain and hero. So as far as like the diversity for aspects, we do not have a very like aspect diverse format. The other is hero is much more represented right now than villain, right? And most of the villain strategies are one strategy, which is ramp. And it's split into a few different categories. But to piggyback on that, ramp. So ramp is very prominent as well. We have a couple leaders that, actually like 3 leaders with built-in ramp, both Hans and Piet, as pretty popular decks right now. And they all have leaders that ramp innately, and a couple of those decks will also play green to add the ramp cards. So ramp is a very prominent strategy, although where ramp fits into like the trio of like aggro, mid-range, and control is not always clear, right? Because ramp is none of those 3 specifically. And in fact, we have aggro decks that play ramp, we have mid-range decks that play ramp, and we have control decks that play ramp. So is ramp being everywhere actually affecting diversity, or is it just mean ramp is everywhere and it's everywhere and that's it? Like maybe it's not affecting the game negatively to have a lot of decks using ramp. Next up, year 1 leaders continue to dominate, and that is very true. Year 2 leaders outside of the JTL pilots and Piet, which is kind of like a pilot deck, they're kind of nowhere. There's like a few fringy ones. They'll get their chance, I assume, post-rotation. No matter what you do with suspensions right now, you are not going to suddenly unlock these leaders. So if that's what you're hoping for, you gotta wait a little more, a few more months. It's almost there. But changing the format right now is not all of a sudden going to unlock those leaders. Year 1's leaders are just better. And that's fine. A lot of them are just generically powerful, which is kind of the reason they're better, because they don't require very much synergy. Next up, midrange is the most popular archetype of the trio, aggro, midrange, and control. Although not by much, and way less than people actually think. Like I hear all the time, we're in a mid-range grindfest meta, and I look around, I'm like, no, we're not. We simply aren't. There's a bunch of aggro decks in this format right now, and there's also control decks. So sure, mid-range is the most popular archetype. 2 of the top 3 decks are mid-range decks, although they are wildly different styles of mid-range decks. And I also want you to remember, the stated goal of the devs is to push the extremes a little bit more towards the middle. It's not to remove control and aggro. It's to make aggro less fast and a little more interactive, and control a little less stally and a little more interactive. And I would say they've probably succeeded so far in the aggro half of this. I think the control half of this we will see maybe become more successful post-rotation, because right now we still have these hard control decks. There's just so much removal that they still can exist, but a lot of it rotates. Lastly, I remind you, at 6 sets, this is the largest a premier format will ever be, which means the most powerful. And this might be the most powerful premier format we ever see, because, you know, maybe we never see a set as powerful as Spark of Rebellion again, or leaders as powerful as we've seen in the first 3 years, like, you know, the Hans, for instance, Anakin, Quinlan, Cad Bane, Rey, Kira, Set 1 Palp, Sabine, right? These are all like really powerful leaders, and, you know, we might be into our next format might just be at a lower power level, but because we're at 6 sets, because the card pool is so big, you're going to have very powerful strategies, and no matter what you start suspending, there will still be a most powerful strategy, and it will still largely revolve around year 1. All right, let's look a little deeper now. So the 3 major archetypes, aggro, midrange, and control, are all represented. They are. So I mentioned the top 3 decks, at least in play rate, not even in win rate anymore. Anakin's win rate has dropped substantially, but Anakin Green, that is a mid-range deck. Although very much an aggressively slanted mid-range deck. Yoda Data Vault is a mid-range deck, but much more slanted towards big ramp and has more control elements in it, Anakin deck. And Han 1 Green is the next top deck, and that's an aggro deck. Full stop. This deck, I think, gets thought of as a mid-range deck for some reason. Han Green has routinely outraced Sabine for like a year in the heads up. It is an aggro deck. The deck almost always just attacks face with its units. It's playing big ships ahead of curve. It attacks face, and then it plays a 7-drop on like turn 4 or turn 3 and hits your face with it. That's what Han Green is. It's an aggro deck. Just because it plays resupply doesn't mean it's not an aggro deck. So of like the tier 1, we have 2 of those represented. In the next tier, we have a deck like Kira. That's a control deck. And then we have like the grouping of hard control decks, whether or not they're like Plot Palp, Palp 1 Colossus, Dedra Iden. Like, none of these decks individually have a large play rate, but when you add them all together, it's actually a pretty substantial piece of the meta puzzle. Meta pie, I should say. So you get those decks as well. What other things do we see floating around? We see Pilot Aggro. Those are aggro decks. You see Han 2 in a mid-range shell with blue and a hard aggro shell in ACL. You see decks like Piet and Boba, which I'm not entirely sure where they fit in the 3. I'd say they're more aggro than they are mid-range, but they're like somewhere in between there. Yeah, so all archetypes definitely represented. Again, we are not in some like mid-range only world, no matter how much you hear that parroted all over the internet right now. Second, very important, at least in my mind, individual games allow for a lot of skill expression. I do believe this format right now is a pretty balanced one in individual gameplay. There aren't a lot of blowout matchups, first of all, which I think is great. I mean, there are some. There's lots of playable decks, so every deck will have some like ups and downs, but we're much more in that yellow area for most matchups, which means skill expression is really important. And there's not a lot of like blowout cards and draws. There still are some, right? Like Han 2 going first with like Ogdo Bogdo and Grogu. Those can be like pretty blowout starts in some games. Han 1 sometimes, like if he starts Falcon against your space deck, or if he has a resupply in the first 2 turns, can feel a little blowouty. And I'm not going to deny that they exist, but it's less than it's been in the past. I think there's a lot of room to navigate a lot of matchups. And I do think the format has a large amount of deck diversity, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. I think this format gets way overblown in that it's like a narrow format. There's a ton of playable decks. The issues, which we'll touch on, are a little more about aspect diversity, right? Where green is basically one of the main like in your face issues. All right, so this is a brand new meta, right? We've had 3 weeks of PQ. Well, I guess 4 weeks if you count the really tiny week of just a handful of PQs that happened just now, but basically this is a brand new meta. So why are we so annoyed with it already, I should ask? And this, I don't have an answer to this, and I can't say we, right? You individually might not be annoyed with it. I'm not that annoyed with the meta currently, but what's the issue? It's a brand new meta. Some of the leaders that are tier 1 right now have never, ever been anywhere near that. Yoda, he was like a fringe deck last set and basically not really ever represented before that. Anakin, he's as green, basically has never been an archetype until now. Is that a problem? What about Piet? Piet was never good enough, and now all of a sudden maybe he's good enough. Han 2 ECL has replaced Sabine ECL as the premier ground aggro deck. There's shifts have happened. Do we need to be bored with them already? Again, like all the major archetypes are represented, and I want to reiterate, the year 1 leaders are the best. This is not going to change with suspensions, unless you suspend all of them, and then it'll change. So let me ask you some questions, and it's kind of rhetorical. You answer them for yourself. Is this format bad? And if it is, why do you think it's bad? What are you looking for in SWU competitive decks, right? This is competitive focus. This is not about kitchen table play or local FN, like Friday games, or like even like a store showdown. This is for people going to PQs and sectors and regional. So what are you looking for in this game for your competitive enjoyment? Like, what is it that you want to be able to do that you can't do? And do you think it's a reasonable thing to want? Is this format worse than previous formats we've had, right? I think we tend to over exaggerate the faults of like what's happening currently, and we kind of forget about the issues of older formats. I've heard a lot about like reminiscing about force throw meta, which is like wild to me because I thought that format was miserable. And you know, like at the time, tons of people couldn't stand force throw. So what are we like thinking are the faults currently? And are we just forgetting about issues in the past and overblowing issues in the future? And I guess the question for this video is, do you think suspensions would improve the game today? Would suspending something from this meta be positive for the game? And if so, why? All right, so I did spend a decent amount of time talking about the current format, but I want to just kind of put this out, right? These are the top 6 leaders in play rate currently. Anakin, Yoda, Han, Piet, Kira, Han 2, and Han 2 is actually only on this list because I combined blue and green. If you separate those two, he does drop a little bit, but again, this is leader play rate, so he's this high. We've got fast mid-range, slow mid-range, aggro. Then we have Piet, which is like whatever, I don't know where to include that. Then you have Kira, it's a control deck, and then you have Han, and you know, like Kira is like pseudo control, right? It ranges from, depending on how you build it, from like a soft control, maybe even like a big mid-range deck. And then Han, either as ECL as a pure aggro deck, or as blue, more of a mid-range deck. So on this list, you do see mid-range and aggro pretty represented. Control only as Kira, and she's probably the smallest of a control deck. If you go even deeper, though, this is what's next on the list. We've got Sabine, actually, as the next highest play rate leader, Boba, and Vader. All 3 of those are basically aggro decks. Boba, you can call it like a fast aggro mid-range style deck. You have Cad Bane. He falls somewhere on the mid-range scope, another aggro deck, and Han, and I think Gar Saxon is also pretty aggro. So lots of aggro, actually, right? Aggro and mid-range more represented than control for sure, which I think, at least my instinct is, a lot of people like that. I think a lot of people don't like playing against control decks. Something I disagree with. I think control decks are very important to the health of the game, and I'm a little worried in the future if so much of the removal gets rotated and doesn't get new versions of it, that we actually could end up in a much more mid-range focused world if we really don't give control any tools. And I didn't even include some on this bundle, right? So Palp 1 blue, Plot, Palp, Dedra, and Iden. If I combined all 4 of those, they would be way higher on this list. And that is your true control decks. They're just kind of split between a bunch of leaders right now. So they're not showing up on like when you sort by like top leader play, you don't see them as much. So yes, control is more represented than it looked like on the previous list. And then finally, a few other standouts. We have Quinlan, Rey, Talzin, Palp 1 yellow. These are all decks that would probably have been like next on the list. Quinlan's an aggro deck, Rey's a mid-range deck, Talzin's like a mid-range aggro, Palp 1 yellow. Probably more on the control slanted spectrum, but plays a little differently than your traditional control decks. All right, so finally, we're on the topic of suspensions for the current set. So these are the cards I've heard the most complaints about. Not all like currently, right? Tarkin Town, for instance, not a peep, although this was like the most hated card in the world for months. No one complains about it anymore because guess what? Things change in the game. All of a sudden, it's not played that much. It's not a top tier card, so you forget it even exists. Does that mean it's absolved of all sins. Maybe, I don't know. But don't forget that it exists, and if you were really angry about it in the past, maybe look at this as sort of some telling information that like things shift and it doesn't always have to happen with suspensions. Data Vault's probably the top of this list in terms of complaints. I'll talk about it in a moment. It gets its own slide. Energy Conversion Lab for most of year one was on the major hate list, especially because of like Sabine. We were all very angry about Sabine for a really long time. Now she's not that great anymore and hasn't been since Legends of the Force came out. So does ECL matter? There's other decks that play it too, right? The Gar Saxon deck. Power of the Dark Side and Overwhelming Barrage. Honestly, I never really understood the complaints about these two cards. They're just good. We need good cards in this game. Overwhelming Barrage is probably the most overrated card in the game for a very long time. It is very good, no doubt, but the fact that this gets talked about as a bannable card is very, very strange to me. It is a very important tool in this game. It adds a lot of gameplay and like it actually like adds deck diversity. It enables strategies that you can play around it. I think the reason it gets kind of the hate it gets is because it's very in your face when it blows you out. It kills like 3 of your units and you feel like it's unfair. You kind of forget about all the times that you were able to play around it by defeating units or keeping your units at certain health thresholds, or your opponent just didn't have the right line to make it work. Even with Kira, if they had to like spend resources before flipping, it's like a lot of things with Overwhelming Barrage. It is a very good card, no doubt. One of the better ones in the game, but that's important for this game. We need good cards in this game, and it fits the bill. Power of the Dark Side, it's at its like all-time worst right now. It's not even very good currently with the way hero decks especially can put multiple units into play very quickly. But yeah, getting your leader one shot must feel bad, but you know, you can play around it. I think it's going to be a shame that cards like this are going to rotate out. That removal in my mind of this power level won't exist very much come next set. If anything, I think that is going to create more issues, push control strategies so far down that we do end up in a more grind fest sort of world. Maybe I'm wrong. We'll see. But neither of these cards, to me, have ever deserved any sort of ban discussion. And then Resupply, a card that's kind of been under the radar in terms of power level. I think everyone kind of knew it was very good, but only recently is it getting talked about as like being too good. And it's another one I'm going to cover in more detail in a moment. So let's start with Data Vault. This card annoys many a people, and it's sort of a difficult one to like analyze completely because it's very difficult to actually like say how much value this is providing, right? We anecdotally make claims about its goodness and how much it affects a game. The times you can, of course, see that it affected the game, right? When you have like 30 or 31 or 32 damage on your base and you win and you're like, yes, it was Data Vault that did it. But there's also all the like hidden value it gives you from like games where you win where you were at 24, but that's only because your opponent had like that 4 power unit with Surprise Strike, but it like that wouldn't have been lethal, so they needed to do something else, and then they never hit your base again, and you won with 24, but you would have lost if you had a 30 instead of a 33 health base. And then on top of that, it's very difficult to like say what it did to your deck specifically, like in the game. Like, did you not draw the card you needed because you had 10 extra? You could have not drawn the card you needed even with 10 less. So it's like difficult to quantify. It's a very annoying card in that sense. Is it doing something bad to the game? That's very difficult to say, right? It is the most popular base getting played. A lot of decks are running it. The Yoda and Anakin, 2 of the 3 most played decks, play it. And then basically all the green villain control decks like Kira, Palpatine, Iden, they all play Data Vault, right? So you see a lot of this card floating around. Is that a problem? Like, maybe. Like, just because a card gets played a lot doesn't mean it's a problem, right? For a very long time, Battlefield Marine was a 3 copy. I keep bringing him up in like every green deck. Is that a problem, right? There's Open Fire. That was seeing play in tons of decks. Takedown, right? These generic cards. Right now, there are other cards we'll talk about that are getting played a ton. So just because something gets played a ton doesn't necessarily mean it's doing something wrong or bad. I hear a lot, oh, this is making aggro bad. Stop. Aggro is like more popular almost than mid-range right now. I mean, if we looked through all the decks I just said, I think more of them were aggro decks than mid-range decks. Maybe not at the top of the tier list, but that's because 2 of the top 3 are mid-range decks. But aggro is in a lot of places, right? So would suspending this make the game better? What about all the decks that don't run it that are top tier? Han 1 Green would just start laughing if this gets suspended. Piet. Does Piet care? Not really, right? Han 2 ECL, Han 2 Blue, they don't care. There's plenty of good decks that aren't running it. So do the decks running it deserve to be nerfed? Does Anakin deserve to be nerfed? He's been a good deck for like 3 weeks. Why are we thinking about nerfing him? What about Yoda? Does Yoda deserve to be nerfed? It started to win recently. It's been a month. Like, is that a reason to suspend something because a couple new decks popped into the meta and are winning a lot with Data Vault? I don't know. I think this one, I will say that, like, I wouldn't mind to see it go just because it has, like, almost become the default green base, although even that is kind of not true, right? Han 1 Green, one of the 3 most played decks, doesn't play this. We have ECL still in the game. I think maybe a better solution would be once ECL and, like, Tarkin Town rotate, maybe you just take Data Vault out as well, because it is sort of on the power level of those set 1 rare bases, whereas none of the other colors were really given a base of this quality. So is it like fair that green is the only one that will have like a tier 1 rare base moving into the next format? Like, in that sense, maybe you can make an argument that just get rid of it. It's like kind of a difficult one to assess its value anyway. But yeah, like, it being in a lot of decks is not a reason to suspend something. And, like, I don't know, aggro was prominent for a very long time in this game and was generating a lot of complaints. The fact that some decks have to play 3 extra life right now has not made aggro decks unplayable. So I don't really know why this gets as much pushback as it does. Resupply. Now, this one is kind of a different story. So resupply is in a ton of decks, right? Of the 3 tier 1 sort of decks, right? Anakin does not play resupply. He would not care if this went away. But if we go into that next list, right? So we see Yoda and Han, and then, you know, Kira, Piet, they both run it. All those green villain control decks run it. Boba runs it, right? A lot of decks play this card. What would suspending it do? First of all, I think it would hurt villain decks more than it hurts hero decks. I think a lot of the glue right now for villain is simply them having access to 6 copies, essentially, of resupply with Super Laser Tech in the mix. They become the consistent ramp strategies. I think they get hit harder than something like Yoda or even Han 1 Green. Like, I know how powerful the resupply line is in Han Green. I still think that deck will be very good without resupply. And sometimes I even think people play this card on turns in Han Green, like turn 1 or turn 2, when they shouldn't be playing it, when there's better things to be doing. So while, of course, he will miss it, I don't think he goes anywhere. Like, Han is just too good of a leader to disappear just because resupply gets suspended. So does Yoda, like, deserve the nerf 3 weeks into being 9% of the metagame? I know I've been winning with it, so, like, maybe I sound biased, but honestly, it's kind of ridiculous to suggest that, like, Yoda needs to be nerfed because it's tier 1 for a few weeks. That's a little much. So does hitting this card improve the game, or does it just shake up the game for the sake of shaking it up? And I think mostly it's the latter. This card has existed for a very long time. It has enabled many, many strategies, and that is fine. I think this card should probably be reprinted. I don't think it will be reprinted going into the next set, but I think it does more to improve the game than it does to make it worse. And I think if we complain so much about every powerful strategy in the game or every powerful interaction, whether it's ramping, whether it's power of the dark siding your leader, whether it's barraging your board or super laser blasting your board, whether it's cheating resources, if we just hate all of this stuff, we will just end in like big number mid-range battles forever. So this card, I know right now it's probably getting played more than it ever has in the past. A lot of that has to do with the fact that Hero Green has sort of popped into the top of the meta where it hasn't in the past, especially like Hero Green mid-range. But like not even all the Hero Green mid-range run it. So another one that like, sure, if it gets suspended, you know what I'll do? I'll go brew some decks because it'll be interesting. But is it necessary? I don't know. All right, speaking of Hero Green, so there have been talks about like this color is just too good. It's not even about any individual card, right? It's just a pile of good cards, and it starts with these, right? So Blue Leader, Captain Typho, Keller, and Beck. These are like the 3 cards that I think are in basically every Anakin, Han, and Yoda deck, right? That's like where I think a lot of our complaints start right now are the fact that tier 1 is 3 Hero Green decks. Now, while they are all very different decks, right? An aggro deck, a fast mid-range deck, and a slow mid-range deck, they share a decent amount of cards, and it's specifically these 3, right? Maybe you throw Queen Amidala in there as well, although she doesn't get played very often in Han 1 Green yet. So these are the 3 I kind of wanted to call out. And the issue here isn't these cards, it's that other colors and other archetypes don't get cards of this power level. We need more of this, not less of this. This is what we need, with one caveat. Every single card on this list should have been a legendary, full stop. No questions asked. The major issue right now with like the game in general is that card prices have plummeted to the point that stores are just like dumping product that is not good for the game. You need cards like this to be rare to make product worth investing in and buying, right? Not as like an investment like a stock market, just like for security of product and for people to have more desire to purchase packs. But having said that, yes, more of this, not less of this. Suspending any of these cards, I think, would be like, no, just don't do it. Blue Leader is probably the one that I think has had the most talk about suspending it. No, the last thing we need is like pilot space spam face decks to like have one of the like best cards against them removed from the game. And then we just end up in more of these like non-games where we're just like spamming and everyone's just like racing and ignoring each other. Blue Leader is a fantastic card. Its issue isn't it's that these effects don't exist, right? There should be a 3/3 ambush in space. Villain should probably have one in some color, maybe yellow or something. I don't know if it doesn't need to be green. There should also be a 5/5 ground ambusher in the game. There just isn't one, right? Like Tyrantitech has the clause where it sometimes has it if there's a force unit. Blue Leader does both of those in one card, but for only one color. So there should have just been more versions of this. Maybe not as good as it, right? Not modal, but both halves of this effect should have existed in other colors. Captain Typho, right? Beefed up Sentinel. Great, right? We didn't want Sabine to continue to be the best deck, or one of the best decks. It probably was never the best deck, but one of the best decks forever. And then we had Churret added in set 5, and now we have Typho. Good. Beefy Sentinels on rate, right? We need more on rate units, not less on rate units. So he's a good card. Keller and Beck, right? He's home 1, but uncommon. Make it make sense. But anyway, these are good cards. They're just all in Hero Green. And that's where, like, maybe you can say there's some problem with the meta is that The best color is just Hero Green, but there will always be a best color. It just happens to be Hero Green right now, and it wasn't for a very long time, right? Hero Green was not one of the better colors in the game, and it is now. All right, so TLDR, suspensions don't really feel necessary to me right now. I think every major archetype is represented, aggro, mid-range, and control, with different versions represented for all of them, whether they're hard control decks with multiple leaders, soft control decks like Kira, mid-range decks can be like fast like Anakin, slow like Yoda, and then you have things like Hantu Blue, which is somewhere in the middle. You even have like mid-range decks like Cad Bane still floating around, and you know, Piet and Boba if you want to include like big ramp mid-range as sort of a subset of that. And of course, aggro, very much represented, right? All these pilot aggro decks exist. Han2 ECL exists. Han 1 Green, yes, an aggro deck. So, yeah, like, I understand that, like, color diversity, aspect diversity is not there. Most of the decks are green. To me, that's not a big issue. But if, like, you really don't like the color green, then I understand why it can be an issue. And then ramp also being very prominent, and you know, part of that is also built into some of the leaders, and you know, that is what it is. You hit resupply, you will get a major shakeup, but will it be for the better? I don't know. I do want to say suspensions are fun. I think I enjoy them, so like I wouldn't complain if something gets hit. It would just give me more content to do and more brewing, and it'll be pretty fun. One thing I should say though, if suspensions are going to happen, I think it should be big, like a big time thing, not one card. It's not like Data Vault done or like resupply done. You want to know what I think? If you're gonna do suspensions, just do it all. First of all, any suspension in my mind has to start with both Hans. I wouldn't even touch a single card before hitting both of those leaders. If you start banning cards, all you're gonna do is make these two leaders better. That's all that ever happens, right? You banned Force Throw, Han 2 somehow got even better because all the other decks got worse. You ban Jango, Han gets better. You ban Boba, Han gets better. It's just these two leaders are the best leaders in a vacuum because they are resupply on a stick. So any suspension in my mind, if you're going to start suspending cards, it has to start with both of those leaders. And then I'd probably just do all the bases because why not? Let's just blow it all up. You can throw resupply in there. If you want to do even more, go for it. You can start banning things like one of those hero green cards. You can hit some villain control tool like power and barrage, and you know, you do all of this, it's still not going to make most of the new leaders tier 1. Like, it just won't. You're just going to shake up the game for the sake of shaking it up. And while I am personally kind of sick of the Hans, it's really probably not the time to axe them. It's like, we just got a few more months of a very high powered format, and it's actually, I think if you look at it pretty critically, pretty fun. Like, the games are actually enjoyable for the most part. Like, they require skill and thought. A lot of matchups are close. There's not tons of blowout wins. If the deck you want to play isn't playable right now, get used to it. That's just how it is. It's like the deck you want is not always going to be a top tier deck. Just the reality of card games. Things shift around. Now, if you happen to have Han as like one of your favorite leaders from the start, you've probably been lucky to never have a bad deck. But in other cases, right, things shift around and it's okay. I recommend broadening your sphere a little bit. Play some more archetypes. Try some of the green decks that are good right now. They're not unfun to play. It's okay. Like, you can pick control, you can pick aggro, you can pick mid-range right now. You can pick a lot of different leaders. There's like double digits that are like clearly good enough to win PQs with. So I don't know. Like I said, if you're gonna do something, I would just blow it up. Like, that's the only way I think I would get behind suspensions right now, is just doing a huge amount of them just to like shake up the game one time before a rotation. But like starting to nitpick Data Vault or resupply or something, all you're going to do is move the goalposts, and you're still going to just see the Hans be the best. And like, yeah, Yoda, maybe Yoda goes away. If probably doesn't, even because like I don't think resupply is like the glue that holds that deck together. But decks like Piet probably would get crushed if like resupply went away. And Data Vault decks would just stop playing Data Vault. Like, okay, they get a little bit worse. Some of them do, maybe. Is like, are we just trying to nerf decks for the sake of nerfing them? Why do we want good decks to not be good or not be as good? You start nerfing things, other things just fill in the void. It's always going to be cyclical like that. There's always going to be the best stuff. And the moment something shifts and new things become best, the complaints will just shift to the new stuff that's best. It's just how this works. And it's kind of what I want to push back on a little bit. All right. That was a long one. I hope you enjoyed it. Keep the comments civil here. I think suspension talk in general gets people riled up a little bit, either pro-suspension or anti-suspension, whatever it may be. I'm open to your opinions, no doubt. I mean, a lot of this video was based on things I've been hearing from various communities and various people in various places. And I'm addressing it, and it's okay. We can have this dialogue. Just make it respectful. But yeah, let me know what you think. And until next time, take care.